Welcome everyone. I've been doing quite a few virtual meetings, as I'm sure many of you have as well. So used to people logging in a little bit later. So we'll just kick things off and allow people to join us as they can. So good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar. My name is Amber Griffith and I'm the chair of the Master of Public Policy Alumni Council. I want to let you know that you are automatically muted, so you don't need to worry about any noise in the background. Throughout the webinar today, the Q&A will be open. You should see that button at the bottom of your screen. Please put your questions there and Neil will answer as many as possible during the final 15 minutes of the webinar today. So before I welcome our guest speaker today, I wanted to say a few words about the Alumni Council. The Council does remain committed to our goal of building a strong network of alumni, students, faculty, and friends of the School of Public Policy. As some of you may know, we held our inaugural AGM last year, which resulted in our first ever elected council. While the pandemic has certainly changed our plans around timing to hold our second AGM, as well as our regularly scheduled in-person events, we are excited to be connecting virtually today. We are so grateful to our speaker and special guest, Neil Hunter, for taking time out of his busy schedule to speak to us today. So with over 25 years of industry experience, Neil is currently a director leading Deloitte's human capital workforce transformation in Western Canada. As a former CHRO, Neil brings a deep understanding of putting work at the center of end-to-end talent processes in various industries and how they are converging in the future of work and impacted by COVID-19. Today, he focuses on enhancing human performance to improve productivity and the overall workforce experience in organizations. He is well-versed in an array of areas, including cognitive recruiting, culture alignment, and the future of work, among many others. His area of focus is all in service of creating workplaces where people can thrive. So without further ado, thank you, Neil, for giving us your time today, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Amber. Appreciate the opportunity to chat and the introduction there. With everyone's permission, I'm actually going to turn off video just because my bandwidth may or may not lead itself to a solid connection. So I will stay off video for a little bit while we talk through some of the content here. I appreciate everyone joining, and I look forward to a discussion at the end of the material I'm going to share. So the first priority during the COVID pandemic has been for organizations sort of crisis response, emphasizing health and safety, essential services, and this virtualization of work that we see happening. And in both work and education. And ironically, I think organizations have made tremendous, been making tremendous strides in this. And in many cases, it wasn't a one and done, it's been a continuous process. And as those respond efforts begin to wane a bit, we see another reality forming in our conversations with leaders in organizations. And it's time now for leaders to turn their attention toward the recover phase. As we think about, respond, recover, and then ultimately thrive, leaders are trying to ensure their organizations are prepared to thrive. And it's going to require some additional focus and against what normally they would be thinking about normal business. It's not a typical recovery. I think COVID-19 is unlikely to end suddenly, given the lack of effective and available therapeutics right now or a vaccine. We believe organizations have to plan for multiple scenarios, time horizons, and shift from crisis response to recovery over the next few months. Should also really be a plan for the possibility of multiple waves of the pandemic and its continuing global and uneven footprint. So organizations that are global or even national in Canada are going to have to consider the implications of various regions and the status of recovery in a very different way. So for workforce strategies, we're really advising critical priorities be set for the next 12 to 24 months. And what I'd like to do today is kind of share some of what we've been talking to organizations about in the context, and then how it really with implications for policy, public policy in particular, and areas to think about as that moves forward. One thing I'd say before we get into the depth of the content is much remains uncertain, but one thing is becoming very clear. Customers, the workforce, suppliers, and partners are watching as organizations handle the recovery phase. It will define brands in a new way, and brands that were strong before will lose market share, and brands that you'd never heard of before in the way that they've handled this are emerging and becoming top organizations for the workforce. So reputations are getting established for years to come and determining future competitiveness. So issues around this topic are of great importance to leaders in all organizations. Next slide. So a great quote from Anne-Marie Slaughter in the New York Times, the virus and its fallout, it's like a time machine to the future. Changes that many of us have been talking about and predicting to happen over decades are instead taking place in the span of weeks. And the implication of that is we're flying by the seat of our pants in many ways. Decisions are being made without all the data. And as a result, there will be imperfection through this process that may come unintended consequences down the road. Next slide. So some of the data, disruption means we're not going back to business as usual. And I put that in the context of 4 out of 5 workers globally are affected by COVID-19, whether directly having to work from home or in some cases, new shift schedules, additional work being done, or certainly new ways of working that have impacted their work experience. CFOs are seeing that a good portion of their workforce could move permanently to remote positions, and yet organizations, especially HR organizations, are not yet equipped to cover the breadth of the implications of that. So if everyone moves to permanently remote positions, there are all sorts of things to consider that we'll talk about here today. And then 38% actually see an increase in daily demand for things like Teams, Zoom, as we're on today. That number is growing significantly as people become more and more familiar with the various technologies and actually get more comfortable with the depth of what each of those brings to the table. So organizations are used to pick one. Now we're seeing the multiple for different purposes. Productivity has been demonstrated during the period. I think early days, we had much higher productivity in terms of focus. Mental health, well-being, and focus has waned a little bit over the past, I would say, 3 to 4 weeks in particular. But certainly lots of folks appreciating the opportunity to work from home, 3.5 times more productive in organizations where you've got digital ahead of the game. And that engagement is key to productivity in terms of 66% of highly engaged employees had no plan to leave their company still through the COVID, whereas 31% of disengaged employees are actively looking. And I truly think that's increasing over the last number of weeks as the dust settles a little bit. Next slide. So in that context, organizations are messing with people's work lives in a big way, not necessarily by their own design, but certainly just by the nature of what's happening. It used to be, mess with a person's workstation or their pay, and those are the two things that had the biggest implication and change in workforce experience and relationship with their employer. But really through this process of COVID-19 and the respond phase, we're really seeing 5 key areas of consideration that I think I want to talk through with you today and the implications on policy, public policy. So the first being the trust equation, and trust was pre-COVID becoming a bigger and bigger issue as organizations began to focus on bigger purpose considerations and the waning trust of the public sector and private sector large tech companies taking on more share of where people get their information from. That trust equation is significantly shifting. But through COVID, there's been a big uptake in organizations understanding the need for trust as they make decisions at pace. And so organizations are seeing the implication of that with their employees. And in particular, as it relates to COVID, ensuring duty of care. Lots of decisions are being made in the context of economic implications, so organizations trying to remain a going concern. But duty of care will become an issue in the future. And we do believe there will be a significant increase in litigation, employer-employee workplace labor-related litigation coming forward as some of the implications of these decisions that were made, right from who and how work from home was determined through considerations now of testing and tracking employees and all the decisions and implications of that. Obviously, protecting health, organizations have had to take on a whole new suite of health protection. Safety has always been a concern in this market as it relates to physical safety on plant or work sites, but even more so now the concept of psychological safety and working remotely and loneliness and all of these things are another big part of this protecting health. And organizations are employing all kinds of technology around screening and monitoring that employees de facto are giving permission for as it relates to COVID, but not beyond that use. And once these technologies are in place, there's a lot of policy missing in terms of what does that mean post-COVID or even through the next 12 to 24 months as those technologies open up possibilities for organizations to use that data for purposes other than initially intended. Staging return to work is another area, and the safe workplaces, right down to when you enter, not organizations are having to look at not just in their physical workspace, but actually how do people get to work? One of the biggest deterrents right now for return to work and staging return to work is employees refusing to take public transit as a result of the implications on their health. And so if you can't even get to the front door because of public transit concerns, this idea of refusal to work is coming forward in terms of if an organization says we are now open for business, we want all our employees back in the office, what policies are in place for those traditional refusal to work policies are not applicable, since we've proven over the last number of months that most positions are able to be done remotely. And so organizations don't have a leg to stand on anymore saying this position can only be done in the office. Fourthly, securing data. And obviously conversations like this are happening many times over a period of a week where individuals are connecting remotely and the cyber readiness and securing of data through those transactions are evolving as we speak. Many of you are familiar, for example, with Zoom as a platform, has had a number of updates due to hacking that took place early in the use of that tool. And so many cyber readiness policies are being considered. And then lastly, complying with regulations around transparency and privacy through this period. So many of the expectations of organizations are built on the back of policies that around transparency and privacy that did not consider the current considerations for COVID-19. Next slide. So we work with organizations to help in their readiness workbook, and I just wanted to share a little bit of the three key components of that, of assessing, building your plan, and then actually operating that plan. And as we'll share these slides later, but as you consider each of these phases, there are policy implications in each one of those to be considered. As organizations are assessing what their plan is and diagnosing gaps, they're trying to use data in new ways and that there aren't policies covering. And so, in the moment, people make decisions with unintended consequences not being considered. And I think going forward, we're going to have to look at the guardrails around some of these areas, whether it's for wave one or the second wave of the pandemic that we know is coming at some point, hopefully not as big as initially anticipated. Next slide. So when we look at the details and what should be in a plan, next slide, we say you're going to welcome back your employees, but are you ready? Let's look at the next slide. So we look at readiness through three components here: work, workforce, and workplace. Organizations need to consider what's coming next. If the possibility of returning to on-site operations is part of that consideration, prep for that will need to consider each of these components. So when we look at work, are we returning to the way we worked before or adopting new ways of working? Almost unanimously, organizations are answering with new ways of working. We can't go back to exactly the way we were before. And in fact, for the next 12 to 24 months, for example, there will be new ways of working for how you enter the workplace and how some of that needs to be done, whether it's the use of PPE that you didn't previously have, or just even physical distancing that needs to take place in a workplace that wasn't there before. For example, in some buildings, we've got policies where only 4 people can ride an elevator at once. And at 8 a.m., when 450 people want to enter that building, that wait in the lobby is a new experience that people will either understand or be frustrated with over time and need to be addressed. So lots of questions there in terms of, with a dispersed workforce, how will we manage risk? What kinds of work can remain virtual? And an assessment of all of that is being undertaken in most organizations now, so that the determination of who needs to come back and when can quickly be made. The capabilities, the capacity of the workforce going forward is also under review. We did see a real bump in productivity. I think the average stat now is that people are working 3 hours more per day than they were previously. That is probably not sustainable either, especially if in the short term, people will do what it takes to chip in and be part of the solution. But long term, without some corresponding reduction in other work, there will be decisions made around the workforce experience and what they're willing to address. As a result of that additional work, we're seeing mental health, well-being, anxiety, stress, loneliness, depression as big issues that organizations are wrestling with right now. And the workforce is in various states of mental health wellness and figuring out what policies need to be in place to address some of these things in a way that previously our benefits plans hadn't considered. And then lastly, the workplace. You take a workplace that has 400 seats of normal occupancy, and you put in the 6-foot distancing spacing that's required, you end up with a capacity of closer to 60 to 70 people on site at any given time. The implications of that on staging your return to work and who comes to work and in what kinds of shifts, where 400 used to be on site, now you have 60 or 70, and the implications and cost for landlords and organizations as they reconfigure workplaces and sanitation processes that are in place, protocols on site for visitors. These kinds of things are all being considered in workplace. Next slide. So who should come back to the office? A plan and being intentional about this and communicating it and having some rationale that or makes sense to employees will be really important. I think every time decisions like this are made, People personalize it and want to know why me or why not me. And also, as I say here at the bottom, the personal factors. Working from home due to a home environment, whether it's the space, the nature of the work, technology, etc., may not be in a person's best interest, even if their work could be done remotely. And so that consideration around your employees' needs and the needs of the organization are factoring into this decision about who should come back and when. Frequency of on-site presence is also important. Do they need to come back 5 days a week? Is it now a hybrid of certain number of days work from home and certain number of days work in the office? If so, if there's any new addition of work from home or work remotely being considered, there are new implications for organizations and liabilities around, for example, ergonomics of a home office, where we were all willing to quickly assemble something. Issues like back issues, neck issues because of incorrect ergonomics in a home office are liabilities that organizations are having to consider now. Next slide. Some of the policies that HR have today that are front and center in this recover phase. So workplace safety, obviously, and compliance with occupational health and safety guidelines, best practices around hazard and risk assessments, which now have new components to them, contact tracing, privacy protocols for health status testing on the job. All of these are considerations that organizations have to address and communicate to their employees, and in some cases to their customers as quickly as possible. This concept of recall, how it's done, and what happens if there's a refusal to work due to safety. These are all considerations, again, that require, in some cases, none of our policies really address the way that this should be done and what considerations need to be in place. I think public policy has a role here in helping organizations with the critical few, or at least the minimum viable product around number one and number two in particular, so that there is some guidance to organizations around and not solely relying upon their values to make these determinations. And I'll talk a little bit around the trust required through this process as well. There are examples already of job abandonments that are happening, and public policy and, frankly, labor law is not clear. The previous labor law around this particular thing, and so the courts are going to have to make some determinations around duty of care, etc., as it relates to some of these things. A number of organizations deemed essential services have done pandemic wage increases, and managing the climb down from a temporary wage increase for non-healthcare essential service workers, etc. The top-up pay that food and grocery sector has been putting in place, and many other sectors as well. And the contingent and short-term surge in hires will also be an issue around policy, as organizations hired folks and now will have to let them go as we get back to recovering regular demand. Lots of policies around remote working, performance metrics, privacy, quality, KPIs, all of these things are big components, and sustained demand for remote working for non-essential service workers is going to be something we have to consider. I think this is not a temporary, well, we know this is not a temporary new way of working. This is the future of work. One component of that, and we will have to catch up in terms of what the implications are of that. And then lastly, restructuring that organizations are doing, often driven by cost constraints and making sure they get down to the critical few of their workforce. But even beyond that, recession proofing and ensuring that key executive remain engaged and interested in staying with the company. Incentive plans, stock options, key agreement terms are all under review now as as leaders look and have options, as do top talent now have options to consider where to go next. One of the implications of the mass layoffs that we've had across many sectors is when the return to work signal comes and rehiring begins, it opens up a whole new opportunity for organizations to reset their talent and for top talent to reset where they put their efforts. And so we will likely see quite a bit of turnover happening over the next 12 to 24 months in organizations as those opportunities begin to unfold. Next slide. Obviously, one of the biggest considerations on recovery for organizations is how to actively screen and monitor related to COVID-19. Next slide. Public policy around health has given lots of guidelines. There is much more to consider. Government has provided those health guidelines and processes for return to work, but the details are being worked by organizations as we speak, and lots of things to consider. Self-assessment and screening versus when you arrive on site, are you going to have temperature checking that's fraught with implications on positive and negative tests. And then there are also tools and technology being explored by clients to improve processes through this period of time, where we begin to have that data that's collected automatically uploaded into an organization's HRIS, etc. Other organizations are choosing to use the data only for its purpose. It has a shelf life of 12 to 24 hours, only collected as required for shift monitoring and to make sure folks can return to work safely. So the gamut and continuum of how this data is being used and how these screening and monitoring tools are being used is quite varied. And we believe long-term there needs to be some policies considered by both employers and by the public policy owners to consider what are the implications of contact tracing, contact tracking, employee wellness monitoring, etc. So privacy considerations, data protection, security, big implications on communication and transparency for organizations to be clear on what they are using this technology for, what they are using screening for, how long they will monitor, how long they will keep that data, educating employees on their responsibilities, all big communication considerations. And then governance. Most organizations have built in some form of a task force to consider and pull across their organizations input into how this process will go, but long-term governance and process enhancement, and I would say policy implications are also needing to be considered. Standard operating procedures will all need to be likely updated as they are implicated by the new way of working as well. Next slide. Some common principles we see as organizations support return to work. Obviously, number one consideration is to contain transmission. Many of the technologies are out there to help organizations do just that, but they do have implications beyond just containment. Secondly, the ability to quickly notify and adapt if someone does arrive on site, whether it be visitor or employee who is positive for COVID-19, what are the processes, what are the implications, and how will an organization quickly react to keep their organization, their other employees and workforce safe. The integration of government guidance and frankly, a two-way dialogue between government and organizations has become more and more prevalent. Organizations that previously did not have government interfaces now do, whether it's just reporting the status of their workforce and health monitoring, or integration of new policies and informing new policies as government looks to stay on top of this. Number 4, a real principle around protecting the vulnerable. The demographic of workforces is not unanimous, obviously, so looking at additional protections where needed for vulnerable individuals within your organization, and the handling of that information in terms of what implications are there where you've been deemed vulnerable, and in the long term for hiring, etc. Will this be used against you? All of those things are considerations that employees are considering in their trust equation as well. Enhanced workforce protocols, new standard operating procedures, etc., are probably going to become written and are being written and shared amongst organizations to ensure that their workforce is safe. Non-essential travel or even essential travel and the easing of restrictions. Who should be traveling and when is all under review. For example, in my organization, last year I only spent about 68 days in Calgary. That will be a thing of the past. The need for me to be on the road as much as I have been is clearly going to change. And so non-essential travel will likely for the next 24 months or so be something that's restricted in most organizations. Next slide. So there is an ethics, privacy, security implication to all of these health screening and monitoring, and organizations need to be intentional and should be intentional in how they address each of these three. Practices and rules driven by ethical standards are going to become something that's under scrutiny, I believe, in the next 12 months as organizations do their response and then have that looked at over the long term. The respect of individuals' right to privacy and the application of privacy principles in design of implementation is going to be very important to the brand of any organization. And then lastly, securing that data and safeguarding throughout the life cycle of the use of contact tracing, for example, is going to be a critical component in keeping trust in place. There's no doubt that whether it's the way it's done or what is done, employees and workforce are looking at each of the decisions that organizations are making and determining whether it's a deposit or a withdrawal in the trust that they have with their employer. Next slide. Just providing you with some details under each of those in terms of what are the key components as you look at the implications on policy. Each of these areas are going to be looked at and considered, and some of these, I believe, would benefit from a pan-organization policy view in terms of each organization are making decisions based on their context, but there is a broader public context for some of these decisions that are being made where guidance would be of value. Next slide. Lastly, and I mentioned this before, this idea of trust, and if we go to the next slide, this idea of physical, emotional, digital, and financial trust is under stress right now. The one that's most prevalent and obvious is the physical trust that your space will be safe. And as I mentioned, that starts right from when you get out of the door, whether you drive to work yourself or take public transit. You are considering your physical safety as you make these decisions as an individual. And so leaders need to consider which dimensions for their workforce matter most as they put their recovery plan in place. And not just through this recovery, but actually as you shift to the new normal, which is a term I'm saying way too often and actually starting to hate, but the way we actually thrive as organizations going forward will be determined by how we address these 4 key dimensions, we believe. And it's an opportunity and a challenge, both. I think leaders have an opportunity to really shift how their employees see them as leaders. It's when leaders can really step to the forefront and build a whole new level of trust and relationship to unlock discretionary effort, and be inspired by the organization they work for. Or the corollary to that is employees feeling like the organization's true colors come out in a negative way under stress, and therefore start to look for other options. And it is a balance of stakeholder trust, whether it's your workforce or your customers, the economic implications, the financial implications that you're doing the right thing by your organization to stay in business, and making sure that you're addressing trust in the digital space in a way that will safeguard your organization from those who are looking to do harm online as well. Next slide. We recommend organizations look at defining how they view trust, and really getting leaders educated in how to navigate that, and an understanding that every decision that's made, every communication that's made, is making either a deposit or withdrawal. And in some of these cases, guidance from policy would really help. In other cases, leaders can't hide behind policy. They need to do the right thing by their employees. But knowing the difference is where wisdom will come for organizations and for public policy alike, to hit the right balance. There is probably, for most organizations, a roadmap, and being intentional for how are they making deposits and building trust in each of those four dimensions we looked at: emotional, physical, and financial. All of those four require deposits to be made, and whether it's with your employees or with your customers. Next slide. And then lastly, let's look at sort of the data implications and some policy implications for that and in the new normal. Next slide. There's no doubt that some organizations were ready and already in a space where they could quickly pivot, and get their workforce working from home quite quickly. There are other examples where IT departments had to pack up desktop computers and ship them to people's homes, and then people had to upgrade their internet connections, et cetera, to make this happen. As a result of the speed at which this happened, readiness for cyber and the holes that are there for hackers to get into people's companies' data bases is much bigger than it was before. And so there is a scrambling right now on cyber readiness and cyber safety that's going in the backdrop of all of this recovery plan. The long-term nature of this means that you'll have to close those permanently, not temporarily. And we do see some real big implications on financial or on the financial side of the organization trying to address this risk. So those are the big buckets where organizations are really looking at how to consider recovery and the implications for public policy. Dan, I'd love to open the floor now for any questions.
Thanks very much, Neil, and hello everyone. So I'm Dan Boucher. I'm a member of the Alumni Council, and so I'm going to be facilitating the Q&A. So if you have any questions for Neil, please put them into the Q&A box using the Q&A box, and we'll go through those. So Neil, our first question that we have is a question around: do you have some advice for leaders who are trying to build trust with a workforce that is worried about their job security post-COVID?
Yeah, great question. I think if the two main concerns people have, primary concerns are their physical health and safety, and secondly, will I have a job And maybe thirdly, what will that job look like? The second one, I think we draw from Maslow's hierarchy of needs here. This whole idea of getting safe organizations, being able to put bread on your table, is of primary concern for organizations. So leaders can't predict the future in a way that satisfies that. For many like for our own organizations, we had a wave of layoffs. The inevitable question after that first wave was, will there be a second, and when? And who will it be, by the way? Want to know that too. So what seems to work well in these situations is transparency. Be vulnerable as a leader to express what you know, sharing the status of the implications and what would be the triggers for your organization to have to consider additional layoffs. Trust is really built with employees when the organization does everything it can before pulling the trigger on layoffs. So considerations around operating expenses, and I would just say the biggest deposit you can make is leaders eat last. That leaders should be they go first and eat last, to quote Simon Sinek's consideration. So leaders should pave the way if there are pay cuts that help organizations cover some of that. I've seen some organizations, for example, our own, we did voluntary flex work programs, so people go on 80% hours, take the corresponding pay cuts, which in our case saved 500 jobs. So people are willing to make those sacrifices if it means that they're able to save theirs or others, their peers' work, positions. And being trusted in that space means if I do this, that you won't then also let 500 people go, right? So that would be a withdrawal. So making small deposits in how you communicate, being transparent, being vulnerable, and you don't know all the answers. I think it's very clear leaders are, making decisions on very little data and very little understanding of what the future will look like, and we have to be patient through that process as employees as well.
Great, thanks, Neil. So we have another question here about, with all these changes happening in the workforce and in the workplace, how can business and policy leaders facilitate, connecting new graduates and students into the workforce? How are they going to continue their recruitment efforts for their talent pipeline, essentially, with this whole idea of a new normal?
Yeah, so great question. Organizations see this return to work as an opportunity to retailor and look at the capabilities and capacity that they require going forward. So as I mentioned, 4 out of 5 employees are impacted. I think 100% of organizations, businesses are impacted. The implication on what kind of talent, what kind of capabilities are required means that organizations are reassessing who they require and what capabilities they require. I actually believe the implication for new graduates, when the recovery process is opened and employees are being brought back in, this idea of rehiring and re-upping their capacity will not be a one-to-one. In other words, they're not going to only bring back those that they laid off. They are going to assess who is available. And new talent is a key component of any talent strategy of an organization. So most do have ongoing recruitment processes in place. And most are looking for new talent in this process of recovery. So it may be a bit delayed. I think for grads right now, you're looking at September, even as late as January for start dates for new grads that are organizations that are hiring, just so that they can get their systems working again and then bring in, rather than bringing people in ahead of that. So it may be a bit delayed, but I don't think the number will be less, and I think the opportunity to pick your organization will be higher. So there will be more hiring going on than there ever has been before, but there's also more talent available. So this is the corollary, and you'll be competing against that talent that's both has experience, which is always the challenge, but you have knowledge and capability that's of value.
Great, thanks, Neil. So we have another question about, so you made a comment about the reduction in non-essential travel for organizations. So can we talk a little bit about the impacts that might have, more broadly, so within organizations, but also broadly within the economy? And
Yeah.
what considerations would we want to think about for mitigating those impacts?
Yeah, I'd love to say, here's what there's a critical few things that I would share. One is reduction in work-related non-essential travel is probably inevitable over the next 12 to 24 months. An increase in personal non-essential travel will also likely be part of this recovery process. So being cooped up and cabin fever for as long as we have, for example, when the US-Canada border opens, I expect a lot more personal travel, people just getting away for a period of time, just sanity, right? So there will be an increase in that, but the workplace implications, I think, are twofold. One, where consulting is linked with this travel, where typical consulting travel implications are organizations want to have those folks on site so that they can look, feel, touch, be part of the infrastructure. That requirement is probably not going to come back in the same way. The implications are relational wise. You're going to have to get culture in a different way, absorb culture and understand culture in a different way. And with folks not being on site and present and not having to do, for example, the same safety onboarding, et cetera, there's probably less people in harm's way as a result of that. Big implications on travel-related insurance. Obviously, the airline industry is trying to predict what does this look like, and what is our new norm for corporate travel, which has typically been up to 70% of the revenues for organizations like airlines. And then other rail and other travel implications, probably an increase in new ways of travel and new ways of handling and booking that travel are being implied through this reduction itself in non-essential. So I'm not quite sure on, if organizations have less of their workforce traveling, the implication on size of footprint of their workplace, for example, will need to be offset because more folks will be local and not at various client sites. There's also the implication on businesses that are linked to travel, so secondary businesses linked to travel, food, et cetera. These industries will all have a shift in what the market looks like and the timing.
Yeah, there's a lot of implications. You can just see the effect as it rolls through, just this one change and this one reduction within how organizations might operate,
Yeah.
and how that can impact.
There's also,
so Neil,
and so this is going to sound probably obvious to most, but if those that are in positions that travel a lot, their work and work-life balance it's built into how they cope, right? And so there are examples of relationships where both partners travel a lot. They don't see each other physically in the same place a lot, but it works for them. They're married, they have a great relationship. You change that dynamic where neither are traveling, they're now stuck in a house together for a long period of time. It's breaking down those kinds of relationships or bonding them closer. So you see an increase in this whole psychological safety and physical health implication. If you're traveling less, proximity to people is different. You built your life around one truth, and now there's a new truth. That has implications just on the safety and health. And I do think we've seen the evidence in an increase in, for example, domestic abuse and other things that are happening as a result of COVID. And unfortunately, we see that probably continuing.
Yeah. So talking about another implication that you had mentioned, so when you were talking about on one of those slides about how the percentage of workers that CFOs saw could be staying remote, what does that implicate? What are the implications for that right now during the recovery, but post-recovery on commercial real estate, for example, on the footprint of organizations?
Yeah. There's no doubt that the tall skyscraper was already under, that construct was probably seen its day. We see, in the Alberta market, certain Calgary and Edmonton, we see a vacancy rate that's unheard of in terms of, and the conversion of commercial real estate to residential is happening quite often as landlords try to pivot around that. I think this will likely, just knowing the human experience, this will likely have a back and forthing. We will all like to be work from home for a while, and the ability to what we miss right now, especially the extroverts in organizations, we miss the opportunity to actually go in and just interface. And so I do think it won't be, even if your work requires and you are able to work from home, can organizations reduce their footprint to the fullest extent? If 74% of positions in corporate organizations could do work from home, can you reduce your footprint by 74%? It's not one-to-one. So I think there is a reduction. You're going to have flex, though, for folks to be able to come in, and more hoteling, as we think of it, in terms of you can come into the office and take a spot on a day rather than having your name on the wall for that spot. So we'll see more sharing of offices for positions that's applicable for. And then much of the real estate will be and is being converted even now to meeting spaces. So the one thing that's missing in most of our corporate footprints is meeting spaces. So you might have 20 offices and one meeting room on a floor. The ratio might shift significantly in terms of many more meeting areas, whether they be big and small varieties, for people to come and gather and then disperse, versus being in the same spot all the time. So the need to meet and the need to share ideas, etc. Technology has done a great job of mitigating it, but there's nothing like being in a room and you can technology whiteboard, or you can sit in a room with a whiteboard and an eraser, and it's something about the body language and the eye contact is still more effective than doing it in technology. And so being in those spaces will still be of value. I think we'll actually see a backlash to everybody working from home and level set somewhere with a hybrid solution. And so there will be a reduced footprint. I don't think it'll be as great as possibly predicted. And we might see city sprawl. People, as a result of not having to commute every day, will now be willing to move maybe 20 miles further out than they did before, and that will be an important part of a consideration.
That's an implication I hadn't thought of about how that might affect urban planning and where people want to live. That's something unique. So Neil, we've come to the end. There's not any new questions that have been submitted. So I just, on behalf of the Master Public Policy Alumni Council. I want to thank you so much for taking the time today to share about what organizations are going through in their considerations for the recovery and the implications that COVID has had, and allowing us to think about what that means more broadly within the economy, society, and therefore for public policy. So thank you so much for that. And thank you to all of our participants who joined us today. And we're grateful that you have joined us today and that you are connecting with your Alumni Council. So please consider looking at some of the other webinars that the School of Public Policy has been putting on. And with that, we'll let you get back to your day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.